Please welcome Stuart Keating.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here giving this talk. My name is Stuart Keating. I'm the state advocate for Environment Missouri, and for want of a better title for such a complex subject, I went with Keystone XL pipeline. Not a very good idea. I hope that puts to rest the Environment Missouri position on the matter. So I'm not actually from St. Louis, but I have lived here long enough to know that when someone asks me where I went to high school, I should just say SLU High and then just be really vague about when I graduated. So I'm actually from Oklahoma. Specifically, I am from Chandler, Oklahoma, which is just to the east of Cushing here. And my family has a farm that's about 10 miles to the east of Cushing, so I know a little bit about the oil and gas industry. My grandfather was a roughneck a long time ago. Quick note on slides, I've never been a huge fan of them. I don't have very many. Getting started with Environment Missouri, I grew up in Oklahoma. I never really thought about environmentalism as a thing that people did, but I had the opportunity to bicycle from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine in the summer of 2009, which was about a 4,000-mile bike trip. And I thought, being from Oklahoma, it was amazing to see all of the things that make America great. You know, the Great Lakes, the Olympic Peninsula, the Northern Cascades, the Rockies, Glacier National Park. It was tremendous to see those natural wonders. But it was also incredibly disheartening to see clear cuts in the Olympic Peninsula and to see the economic and environmental devastation of the Rust Belt. And I realized that I needed to step up and protect these things if I enjoyed them so much and I thought they were worth preserving. And so that's how I got involved with Environment Missouri. Environment Missouri is a statewide citizen-based grassroots environmental organization. We have members across the state, and we work to protect clean air, clean water, and open spaces. I was hoping, since this is such a complex topic, to break this thing down and maybe talk about the pipeline and sort of give you a literally 30,000-foot overview of the pipeline, and then stop for questions, and then get into what the tar sands are and why they matter, and then stop for questions, and then get into the extraction process, which is super complicated, and then we'll go from there into what's going on with the pipeline and safety issues with the pipeline, if that sounds okay. I know that it's really tough to have a question from the first 5 minutes of a talk and then have to sit through a bunch of chemistry and history and everything else. So without further ado, we are here to talk about the Keystone XL pipeline, which is actually 4 pipelines. The Keystone 1 pipeline, which is this green line that runs kind of in a Z shape here, very poorly drawn Z, from Alberta to down to Nebraska and then across Missouri to the Wood River and Patoka refineries in Illinois, was the first part of the pipeline. It's owned entirely by TransCanada. It can move about 500,000 barrels of synthetic crude oil per day through it. That's a barrel is 42 gallons. A barrel will come up a lot in our talk today. So 42 gallons is 500,000 barrels. That's 20 million gallons of synthetic crude and something known as dilbit, diluted bitumen, running through that pipeline every day. The pipeline itself is about 2,000 miles long and was completed in October of 2010. And the second portion of the pipeline, Keystone 2, runs from this point in Nebraska about 270, almost 300 miles down here to Cushing, Oklahoma. Cushing, Oklahoma is actually the sort of main juncture for all pipelines in the United States. There's about 200,000 miles of petroleum pipeline crisscrossing the United States. And if you want to get anything from point A to point B across country, it's probably going to run through Cushing. So connecting the pipeline down to Cushing enables TransCanada to enter a whole different market for refineries and for finished products. And in addition to finishing that pipeline, which they did in 2011, they built 11 additional pump stations along the Keystone route, which enables them to push more oil product through the pipeline. Obviously, the pipeline here and down here are 30-inch pipelines. And obviously, if you want to move more product through the pipeline, you have to move it through faster. And so they can now pump about 600,000 barrels through each day. Now, the third portion, which is currently under construction, Keystone 3, will run from Cushing, Oklahoma, all the way down to Netherlands, Texas, right by Port Arthur in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's obviously exurbs of Houston. There's a lot of refineries there. That portion will be about 500-ish miles. I don't think they are planning to build additional capacity to pump more product through it. It is, however, a 36-inch pipeline, which is it's about 3 feet. So from the floor to here is probably about the diameter of those pipes, and they're generally buried about 2 feet below ground. That pipeline is currently being constructed. President Obama, in January of 2012, in a very public speech, fortunate speech, authorized the EPA to move full speed ahead and cut through the red tape to get this section of the pipeline built as soon as possible. And that pipeline is being constructed in bits and pieces along the route there that's marked in dotted red lines, despite the best efforts of local property owners, farmers, rangers, activists, and some cute little grandmas that like to lock themselves to blocks of concrete in and around the equipment and pipeline itself. Not that I, as Environment Missouri, condones such activity. The fourth section of the pipeline is really what puts the XL and the Keystone XL, and this is really what's been in the news lately, as much as this has been in the news. And that's this big red dotted line that makes a beeline from all the way up here in Alberta, pretty much a straight line. We'll talk about what this is here in a minute, down to the Nebraska terminus. I guess it's not really a terminus because nothing ends there anymore. The Nebraska Waypoint, I guess, junction. That's the plan that is currently being held up in the EPA's review process. When completed, it would be able to transport 800,000 additional barrels of synthetic crude and diluted bitumen from the tar sands to the Nebraska juncture. From a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, this represents an incredible investment in the exact wrong type of energy. This is really a step backwards in terms of energy use for the 21st century. And the reason that this yellow thing is highlighted is because this is an ecologically sensitive sand hills region in Nebraska. It's a fantastic national monument, national natural monument. A lot of really cool sand dunes. And this pipeline, like I said, will be about 800,000 barrels a day. TransCanada is in charge of constructing it. They have the completed sections of Keystone 1 and Keystone 2 cost about $5 billion total. Keystone 3, which is supposed to be completed in 2015, and the Keystone Phase 4, which we have no idea if or when it will be completed, are projected to cost about $7 billion. And we'll get into a little more the importance of the Sand Hills region and the Oglala Aquifer and the issues with the First Nations tribes in Canada and the Native tribes in Montana and the Dakotas, like the Oglala Sioux and the Blackfoot and Cree, a little bit later. But do we have any questions about the overall construction of the pipeline?
Hasn't the increased use of fracking made that energy source a lot less expensive and reduced the demand to have something like this?
So the question was, has the use of fracking made natural gas cheap enough to offset the costs or to make the use of oil sands not profitable? And how that stands right now is natural gas is actually really, really cheap because there's so much of it. I mean, they can pump it out. And they actually use a significant amount of natural gas in the process of purifying the oil sands. As it stands now, global oil demand is so high, especially for heavier crude oil, like what comes out of the oil sands, that they are able to make a pretty big profit on oil sands. And then, did you have a question?
Well, you sort of answered the question. I was wondering, the oil, what type of oil that is that's moving.
Okay, so that's actually, thank you for that question, because that leads us right to the next part, which is about the oil sands. So we'll get to that in just 1 second.
So these pipes are buried.
Yes, they're buried. They're generally, this is a 30-inch pipe, and this is a 30-inch pipe, this is a 36-inch pipe, and these will be 36-inch pipes. So that's 3 feet. That's going to be from the floor to here. And they're generally run about 2 feet underground.
in contrast with the Alaska pipeline, which is above the ground.
Right, and the reason they did that in Alaska was because a lot of the Alaska pipeline is over frozen ground that you really can't dig.
Okay.
So that's the overview of the pipeline, and so I think we should probably go all the way up to where the tar sands are, and we should talk about how they're produced and what then flows through these pipes and what that means for the environment and for us culturally and for globally in terms of greenhouse gases in the future. So tar sands, we call them oil sands or tar sands because it's a really, I mean, you can imagine just a whole bunch of sand soaked with like grimy oil. You know exactly what that looks like. It's a really great term. What it really is, though, is bitumen. Bitumen is kind of like bituminous coal. It's a substance that's a lot like cold molasses. It's very thick and it's full of a very heavy crude oil. A very heavy, very crude oil, and it's got a lot of delightful substances in it like sulfur and lead and mercury and chromium and selenium and arsenic, among many others. And so it is essentially, it's a hydrocarbon, so it comes from decayed animals. In this case, it lies underneath a very large boreal forest. The boreal forest actually extends all the way across up here and then all the way around Russia and Kazakhstan and parts of China and Northern Europe, and is the world's largest biomass, or terrestrial biomass. And it's a huge forest. It purifies a lot of the air on Earth. It's one of the larger recharge zones for CO2 to be converted into oxygen through photosynthesis. And there's also this. Oh, you know, I have photos of this. Why are we looking at the pipeline? So this is a boreal forest. Closed, you know, it's closed canopy. The trees are very close together. You can't see them, but there's a lot of moose and grizzly bears and other exciting things that you see on postage stamps in Canada in there. And this is muskeg, M-U-S-K-E-G. It's essentially a peat bog. So it's kind of like a northern swamp. It borders the tundra. And this area is very, like, you can't actually walk on any of this. It's very thin, very soupy, and it lies over the oil sands. The reason I'm talking about this, we'll get to in just a minute. So that's what the muskeg looks like, and that's what a boreal forest looks like. So the original people that lived in this area were the Cree Nation, and they discovered that they could use this bitumen as pitch or tar, essentially, to waterproof their canoes, waterproof their clothing. Europeans didn't really discover the bitumen until the gold rush in the 19th and early 20th century, and they noticed that this was essentially an oil source that they could possibly use if they could figure out how to get the oils out of this big clump of sand and tar and everything else. So in 1927, the first attempts were made at pulling hydrocarbons or usable hydrocarbons out of the bitumen, and it didn't work. They knew that they could put oil in, they knew they could heat it up, and the oil, or they could put water in, they could heat it up, and the hydrocarbons that they wanted would separate from the sands. But there was no way to feasibly do it in a large scale, and there was no real way to transport it. And since this was 1927, oil across the country was really cheap. We were drilling out Oklahoma, we were drilling out Texas, Kansas, California, anywhere you could put a well in the ground, they were doing it. It wasn't until 1967 that that profitable mine was opened. And in 1967, that was Suncor that opened that mine, and it's still in operation today. In 1976, the largest mine of any sort in the world opened in the Alberta tar sands region. It's right by the Athabasca River, and that's operated by Syncrude, and it's still in operation today. And there are two other mines in the area. They work about 80 different sites in the area, and this is a boreal forest. This is what the mines look like. Yeah. So clearly, it's a very intensive process to not only scoop up these oil sands, but then to purify them. So the overall scope of this project, obviously, this looks huge, and it is huge. They're currently processing about 1.8 million barrels a day from the oil sands, and they anticipate by 2018, so 5 years from now, they will be able to process 3 million barrels a day. That's 3 million times 42 is 12 million gallons of oil every day coming out. No, 120 million gallons, there we go. So every week about 1 billion gallons of oil coming out of this. So that's basically where we're at. And those 1.8 million barrels of oil have to come out of the ground and then be converted into a usable product. And the way they do that is by applying heat and water. But first, in order to apply heat and water, they have to scoop this stuff up and use it. So if you can imagine sort of like a 7-layer dip, one of those bean dip things, you have up here at the top anywhere from 4 to 14 feet of grass, trees, swamps, muskeg, boreal forest. You have this 14-foot layer. You then, underneath that, have anywhere from 0 to 200 feet of clay and mud and really hard soil and rocks. Underneath that, you have the oil sands. So it's not like someone's going out with like a shovel and a bucket and just picking this stuff up. They have to first bulldoze and clear 14 feet of biomass, and then go in and bulldoze and clear up to 200 feet of clay and mud. And again, this is areas that are occasionally frozen in the winter to permafrost. And then they actually get to start the real work of mining these sands. So this is, in order to get dollars out of this, you have to put a lot of dollars in, which is why they're continuing to do it. So what they do now is, for these strip mining sections, they use 100-ton earth shovels, these giant earth shovels that can scoop up ridiculous amounts of sand and oil, and they put it in 400-ton dump trucks, and then they drive the dump trucks on these roads. And they drive the dump trucks on these roads to pre-treatment facilities where they do the initial breakdown of the bitumen. And they initially break it down by adding water and sodium hydroxide. I don't know if anyone's familiar with sodium hydroxide, it's lye. So they take this superheated, caustic, greasy mess that they've created and they slurry it through pipes to a refinery where it's then further refined. And they refine that by taking these gigantic tanks of water and detergents and some other pretty bad chemicals and essentially heating this oil up to the point, or heating this material up to the point and shaking it in these giant tanks until the oil settles to the top and all of the solids that bind with the water sink to the bottom. So what you're left with then are these hydrocarbons that are at this point, they still need to be processed, but you end up with a more liquid bitumen that is usable, and then a gigantic amount of toxic waste. I don't know how else to say it. It's purely toxic waste, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So to give you an idea of how inefficient this process is, in order to get 250 pounds of oil, a barrel of oil out of the tar sands, so essentially me plus like a backpacking backpack, in order to get that much oil out of the tar sands, you need 2 tons of tar sands. So if you were to take 4,000 pounds of tar sands, that's how you're going to get 250 pounds of usable hydrocarbons. And that requires anywhere from 8 to 16 tons of water and about 6,000, essentially the equivalent of 1/6 of a barrel of oil in terms of burning natural gas. And they burn the natural gas to heat up this water slurry. That's where the water goes in, and then they're left with essentially a little over 1.5 tons of toxic waste for every barrel of oil they're producing. Which doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's that great of an idea in the long term, or really even the short term, but what do I know? I'm an environmentalist. So that's essentially how the extraction is done. And once they have done what's known as cracking, once they've cracked the hydrocarbons out into bitumen, they further refine it in a process known as upgrading, that I won't bore you to death with the details, but they use fractional distillation, diesel, a variety of other chemicals, and essentially make a synthetic crude oil, is what it's known as. That's why the company is called Syncrude. And the synthetic crude oil, which is still heavier and thicker than regular crude oil, is pumped through the Keystone XL pipeline. So that's what they're moving through the pipeline. And occasionally they will move what's known as dilbit, which is as appealing as it sounds. It's diluted bitumen. So rather than actually processing the bitumen that they pull out into synthetic crude, they will slurry it with hot water at pretty intense pressure through these pipes that are between 2 and 3 feet under your feet, which is, we will talk about some safety issues with the pipeline here in a bit. So that's essentially the extraction process. I hope that it wasn't terribly boring. Do you guys have questions on that before we get into some of the environmental?
I have a quick question. Where are they getting the water that they use?
Okay.
Is that from aquifers or?
So the question was, where are they getting the water? And they're getting that water from the Athabasca River primarily. So the Athabasca River area is the only area where you can actually drill, or you can actually mine for this oil rather than drill for it. And so they're allowed to use up to 1.4% of the water's daily flow. And they're currently using about 0.5% of the water's daily flow. I mean, this is, like, the Athabasca River is pretty huge. We're talking, Merrimack River size or larger. It's actually way larger than Merrimack River. It's a huge river, and they're using, a significant percentage as a single use to process this oil, and then they obviously shouldn't and can't put the water back into the river. So they have created a whole bunch of sediment ponds around this area where they leave the toxic sludge that's water and mud and toxic chemicals mixed together in a settling pool, with the idea being that all the bad stuff will settle down to the bottom and they can take the water off. The recovery time on these sediment pools is years. It takes years for this stuff to settle out, and even then the water's not clean. And the entire time that it's settling, that water with those impurities is evaporating into the atmosphere to end up back in the ecosystem. Yes,
So
sir?
where is this toxic waste going?
I don't think there's anyone that can answer that question, including the people that are producing the toxic waste, because there's so much of it. Basically, it's kind of like any other strip mining operation. They have these huge holes, right? I mean, they dig huge holes. They've got 400-ton dump trucks, and then they have this toxic waste, and so they start looking around, and they're like, "Well, we'll just put it back in the hole." Brilliant idea, I know. So they started doing that. They started refilling the giant strip mines they had dug with this toxic mud. Some nitpicky scientists discovered some groundwater contamination and a whole lot of mutated fish and some polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are the kind of thing that keep you up at night if you know anything about chemistry. And they started finding this spreading out through the environment. And so now they take a lot of it and dump it into old salt caves that they've found, which also seems like a bad idea. Sure.
How large is the area?
The area, okay, so the area covers, and I don't think we actually have a picture. The scope is actually really huge. Yeah, so you can't really see it. It's this big shadowy area. Imagine England, like the country, the island, but bigger. It's a little bit like maybe 1.1. It's a little bit bigger than the size of the country England. So it's a big area. I mean, that's if you were to look at northern Canada, it's approximately the same. I mean, it's huge. Canada is one of the largest nations on Earth, and a lot of that is upper Alberta, where the tar sands are. Yes, ma'am?
So what percentage of the forest has already been destroyed?
So they have, I don't have the exact numbers on percentage. I know that they have torn up about 160 square miles so far, and that's just with the mining operations, not with any of the other infrastructure built in. Because you can imagine that getting from this to Mordor takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of equipment, it takes a lot of infrastructure, it takes towns, it takes airstrips, it takes rail yards, it takes any number of things in order to really ruin the environment on this kind of scale. And it takes some gumption and some know-how. So they're right at 160 in terms of the overall mining, and then they have plus for the human settlements and boomtown type stuff they've put in.
And who owns the land?
That's a great question, and actually comes into some of the political stuff we were going to talk about. Canada ceded much of this land to various bands of the Mountain and Plains Cree Confederation, and which the Cree are basically a linguistic confederation of First Nations that exist somewhat in Quebec, but then mostly west of the Great Lakes region. West, that's west. And in 1899, they signed something, the British government and Canada, the Canadian territorial government, signed something known as Treaty 8 with a number of tribes and set up basically tribal nations around this area. And so the Canadian government still owns quite a bit of it, but there is mining on or near a significant number of tribal lands. Specifically, the Beaver Lake Cree are one of the tribes that's really spoken out against this because their traditional way of life has been impaired by water pollution and habitat loss. Do we have other questions on extraction? Okay. Oh yeah, that's right. We actually don't have any more slides, so we'll just leave it on that one. Don't really need slides for some of this. So that's essentially how the process is broken down into hydrocarbons. And that leaves a lot of really serious environmental issues. And it also leaves a lot of cultural issues, which, thank you for bringing up the land ownership thing. That's one of the huge issues with the pipeline as well, is that a lot of this land is sacred or traditional land for a very large number of First Nations and Native peoples. And so having a bunch of miners come in and dig it up is obviously causing a bit of a consternation, and they have done a lot of petitioning to the Canadian government and to the United Nations and to the European Union.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
And as a follow-up, so if these tribal nations, like the Cree, if they own the land, how are they getting revenue from the companies that are on the land? I mean, what's their motivation to allow these people?
They do receive revenue payments. They receive royalty payments. That's actually how the oil and gas industry has worked since time immemorial. If you put a well in or you drill for hydrocarbons, whoever owns those mineral rights, whoever owns that land, is entitled to a royalty payment.
So they've had to, of course, give permission and have.
Right, but I think it was more like, we're going to come in and do it anyway, so you can have some money, or we're just going to do it.
And who would allow that? And who would prohibit that?
Another great question. That's actually, we're about to get into a little acronym thing. So the relevant government agency, and Canada's kind of cool because their top level government agencies are actually run at the province level. So the Alberta Energy Resources Conservation Board was the government entity that oversaw the mining operations since they began. And they really oversaw all natural resource extraction operations in the region since Alberta was a founded province. At some point in the past 20 years, and forgive me for not knowing the date, they changed their name to the Alberta Energy Regulator. Which sounds like kind of like a cool like superhero type thing, but
Peabody Coal.
yeah, exactly. It's like Peabody Coal. So what ended up happening is you have this government agency that was chartered by the government and existed to manage the resources, to an agency that operates at arm's length from the government and is 100% funded by Suncor and Syncrude and Chevron and Valero and Royal Dutch Shell, who now manages those resources. If you can imagine how an industry-funded regulatory agency would work, I mean, well, look at Congress. That's what you're going to get. I mean, you're getting what you're paying for, and if the people aren't paying for their government, then they're going to get corporate governance. So that's a large part of some of the issues. They actually finally just got around to agreeing that maybe they should have some sort of a board of independent people that would review the environmental impacts, and they've been doing for almost 50 years. So good job, progress. We're going to have a board that's going to look at some things that have been going on for 50 years. And so I know that we can talk about water pollution all day long. We can talk about how in a lot of the standing lakes around the region, silt samples have shown a 23-fold increase in polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and other cancer-causing and mutation-causing and generally life-ruining substances, and how that's actually showing up, and you're finding higher levels of, like endangered level, life-endangering levels of arsenic in the moose population in the area. So we can talk about those, but that's still, I mean, that's really bad, and it's bad locally for this, and certainly bad for the people that live on this land. But the global warming implications of this are tremendous. So it's currently pretty cheap to make tar sands or oil sands work. It's pretty cheap to get those hydrocarbons out in terms of dollars, but in terms of burning carbon, it's tremendously expensive. It actually it burns about 22% more, or releases about 22% more global warming pollution than drilling for oil or drilling for oil traditionally. And then the oil itself is heavier and generally burns less clean. I think I have some really fun numbers here. They're really big. So if we finish the Keystone XL pipeline, the actual pipeline transportation and the increase in extraction would lead to the equivalent of having an extra 73 million cars on the road. That's how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases would be released. And the global warming impact of it's also the global warming impact the current level is the global warming impact of installing 6 more coal plants or putting an additional 4 million cars on the road. So we've already got some pretty bad greenhouse gas emission problems coming from this, and it's slated to get worse. Obviously, they plan on doubling the amount of hydrocarbons they're going to produce. And of course, the other really big problem is our economy is somewhat of a closed system, not entirely. And so every dollar, and there have been $12 billion into the pipeline, who knows how many billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into that. Every dollar of investment, and especially government incentive and subsidy that goes to that, is money that doesn't go to wind and solar and energy sources that allow us to move away from coal and oil. Personally, I and Environment Missouri would like to see a future in which we get all of our power from things that leave this rather than this. And so the significant investment here represents a complete step backwards in energy policy. So completion of the Keystone XL pipeline would represent a, yes?
You said it's relatively inexpensive to get this oil, but I read that energy return on energy invested for tar sands oil is a lot worse than for conventional oil.
They are actually, I was looking at this and I wasn't able to figure out the numbers. I wasn't able to figure out an unbiased source for the numbers. I saw one from the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council, and then I saw a much different number from all of the industry publications. But the return on investment, energy return on investment for tar sands is about 6 to 1. So for every barrel of oil you put into generating your activities here, you get 6 barrels out, which is not great. I mean, traditionally we would get 80 to 1 on oil, and that's come down a lot because we've drilled out most of our oil. But in places like Saudi Arabia and places like Venezuela, where they can actually pull oil out of the ground still pretty easily, the energy return on investment is much higher than it is here. And again, we're actually pumping natural gas from Texas and Pennsylvania and Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska up to. So we're transmitting synthetic crude down a pipeline, and we're taking natural gas up a different pipeline and burning a bunch of natural gas to get this synthetic crude. So it's kind of, I don't know, it feels very circular to me, but I could be wrong on that. Do we have other questions? Yes, sir?
And like you were saying about with the lots of money that's going in here, and like the money going in here and not worrying about other with like carbon and stuff.
Right.
Would people like ever like do half and half, like still sort of put some of their money out for carbon and like water and still have some for their work?
So yeah, so the question was, we're investing a lot of money into traditional fossil fuels rather than investing in renewable sources. And could we have it work to have a mix? Was that about right? To have a mix of energy sources? That's actually what President Obama wants to do. So you and the president are on the same page here. He employs an all of the above strategy where he wants to continue doing awful stuff like this, but then also invest more heavily in wind and solar. And a lot of the investment that comes here isn't necessarily oil company investment. Does everyone here pay taxes? I'm assuming most people here pay taxes. You're all investing in the oil industry because we give generous tax subsidies to the people that build, that do this essentially. We give generous tax subsidies to them on the idea that they're creating jobs and stimulating the economy, which I don't think there's going to be very many jobs left there after the oil's gone. But yeah. Yes, sir?
So you mentioned Chevron and you mentioned Dutch, Shell, Dutch. So it sounds like it's not just a Canadian oil concern here.
Correct.
American oil, because I was wondering how does the interface? I mean, how does the American oil industry, view all this going on?
They love it. I mean, it's they're pumping it out here, right? They're digging it out here and destroying the Canadian environment. They pump it underground through America, causing not very many problems, certainly problems they can hide, and then it's refined here, and we get a huge cut of it. Like American companies get a huge cut of those profits. So, and that's kind of traditionally what happens if you look at Nigeria, which also has tremendously terrible oil extraction practices. They extract the oil there, and then they bring the crude over here in giant boats and refine it here, and then the real profits are made on the refining stage. But the other big thing is I don't think there is, it would be very rare if there was an oil company that was not a multinational corporation that was, had owners and businesses around the world. So the American oil industry is in essence also the Canadian oil industry, which is also the Venezuelan oil, well, maybe not Venezuela, is also, oil industries around for every other nation. So that's kind of how that works. Yes, sir?
Talking about money, another big profit is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, which Warren Buffett owns 22% of.
Correct.
And they're shipping this on oil tankers down. And so not only because of the environmental part of it, but Warren Buffett does not want the pipeline because he can make profits on the tankers.
And we'll actually talk about that with the pipeline thing, because of all things, you wouldn't expect Nebraska not traditionally an environmental powerhouse, you wouldn't expect Nebraska to stand up against a pipeline running across it, but they did, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You guys are the best. I used to teach middle school French, and I would ask someone to conjugate something, and they would just kind of stare at me. But we're not doing that here, so. So those are the issues, some of the larger environmental issues here. I thought we might switch over and talk a little bit more about the pipeline. So the pipeline obviously has some problems. TransCanada stated that when they built Keystone 1 that it was going to be this sort of model of modern marvelous technology. Didn't repeat any of this. This model of technology that was only going to leak 1.4 times on average per decade. It leaked 14 times in the first year of operation, leading regulatory agencies to actually have them shut the pipeline down while they conducted investigations. And it was discovered that the company, TransCanada, knew about substandard welding, shoddy concrete construction, cheap steel throughout the length of the pipeline, and they essentially did it anyway because it was cost-cutting measures, which is really, really sad from an environmental standpoint, because their cost-cutting measures, I mean, nobody lives in Grand Forks, North Dakota here, except in North Dakota. It's certainly nobody that owns the pipeline. So if it leaks over here, these people suffer because of TransCanada's cost saving. It's pretty reprehensible. TransCanada's record of success continued with the Bison natural gas pipeline that they installed as part of the pipeline that runs, from down here back up here to burn natural gas in the oil sands. They stated that it was also a state-of-the-art, well-monitored pipeline. 60 feet of it blew up 2 months after they issued that press release. The shockwave could be heard for 30 miles. And another investigation was conducted, and they discovered substandard welding, cheap steel, and shoddy concrete work. So I'm not entirely certain I believe TransCanada's claims about the safety of their products. I think if my Honda exploded and I bought another Honda and it exploded, I wouldn't buy a third Honda. Hondas are great. So, and then there were a couple of things that happened this year that were well, not really exciting, but certainly media-worthy. Down in Mayflower, Arkansas, on March 29th of 2013, so just a couple of months ago, 3 months and a day, 2 days, one of the Pegasus pipelines that's owned by ExxonMobil ruptured and sent 12,000 gallons of essentially diluted bitumen, so this really gross, heavy sludge mixed with hot water. They had a rupture and they didn't catch it, and 12,000 gallons flooded this suburban area. I would say you've probably seen pictures of it, but Exxon managed to cordon the area and get the FAA to control fly zones over it so nobody could get any photos of the extent of the damage. They claim they were able to recover 5,000 barrels of oil, so that's, carry the one, 200,000 gallons of heavy crude oil plus arsenic and lead and chromium and mercury and selenium and some other ones that I don't remember, but they ended on. Those 200,000 gallons, were all over the suburban neighborhood, and they had to evacuate the whole area. And then in May of this year, down in Doniphan, Missouri, I think Doniphan is, someone know where Doniphan is? It's in the Ozarks, right? No? Okay, well, I promise you it's in Missouri. A 70-year-old pipeline, we are still using pipelines that are 70 years old, had developed a leak in someone's front yard and deposited about 42 gallons of oil in the front yard, killed off a bunch of plants. So these pipelines are not inherently safe, and when you think about it, having 2,000 miles of poorly constructed and frankly not very well monitored pipeline running across our entire country seems like a pretty big problem, right? I mean, that's kind of self-evident, I think. The pipeline they want to put in here, this Keystone XL pipeline, is a tremendous problem. So we'll start with the least technical problem first. So the least technical problem is that here in Montana, and here in North Dakota, and here in Nebraska, or South Dakota and Nebraska, we have a large number of Indian reservations. The Blackfoot tribe, the Ojibwe, a big portion of the Cree that have lived here have since migrated south to somewhat get away from this, but somewhat because it's warmer. And the Oglala Sioux are located right here, and they, I think probably are certainly very well within their sovereign rights to request that an oil company doesn't come through and dig up their sacred sites and burial sites and places that are traditionally very sacred to them. So that was the first sort of hang-up for this new pipeline. The second hang-up is the Sand Hills area right here. And you can see how it kind of curves around the Sand Hills area. It didn't do that originally. It ran right through it. I mean, why not? Why not just make a straight line? The Sand Hills region, I don't know if anyone's ever been there. It's in the middle. You've been there? It's beautiful, right? It's really cool. It's a really cool landscape. It's these like really awesome, like huge sandy dunes with vegetation on them out in the middle of Nebraska. It's really neat, and the dunes themselves are cool. It's actually a national natural monument. It's like protected by the National Park Service. So farmers in North Dakota, and Warren Buffett, of course, otherwise nobody would have listened to the farmers. Farmers in North Dakota and Warren Buffett started making a lot of noise because they didn't want this pipeline running through their town and or running through their state. And so they brought up the Sand Hills area, and so they brought up the Sand Hills thing, and so the TransCanada said, fine, we'll run around it, no big deal. You know, we're literally made of money. We'll do that, fine. We'll fly the oil to you in jet planes. And then the farmers brought up another really good point, and you can't really see it on here, but like this whole area right here runs all the way down here, completely into the Great Plains, and then a little bit over kind of towards the Rockies, a little bit over into Missouri, is the Oglala Aquifer. I grew up on a small farm. I knew people that grew up on much bigger farms, and they all irrigated their crops, because that's what you do. The Oglala Aquifer provides about 30% of the water used in irrigation throughout the entire United States. So pretty much anything that is grown in the middle third to half of the country is watered by the Oglala Aquifer. So running this huge 36-inch pipeline constructed by a company that is not super worried about structural integrity, and then pushing 800,000 barrels of this extremely dirty, extremely thick crude oil product at very high temperature and very high pressure through this pipeline, through the water that we use to irrigate and water our crops, seems like a phenomenally bad idea. I don't know, I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer, I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure common sense dictates that it's not a good idea. And the big issue here is that the aquifer is very shallow. If it were somewhere like in some of the high plains over here, where the aquifer is 200 feet deep, it wouldn't be a big deal, right? Well, it would be a big deal, but if they had a pipeline that's 2 feet underground and the aquifer is way down here, if or when the pipeline leaks, the amount of contamination to the aquifer is going to be less. In this case, it's going to run through the entire length of the aquifer almost, and the aquifer can be as low as, like, I think 30 or 40 feet underground. This aquifer is very, very high. So it's a huge problem. And so where we stand right now is this is being constructed, and this is held up. And did anyone listen to President Obama's climate platform on Tuesday? No.
What about a deal? Sounds like he settled a deal.
I think that he made some very strong points, and he said some very great things, and he actually finally addressed global warming. And one of the things that he said was that the Keystone XL pipeline will not go ahead if it significantly affects, if it significantly impairs our national interests, including in terms of global warming pollution. So the EPA is currently still doing an environmental impact study on the overall effects of the pipeline, and it's believed that if the pipeline were finished, it could push the global warming emissions. We're currently sitting what, at 400? So we're currently sitting at 400 parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is past the 350 that Bill McKibben says is the absolute stopping point. So we're already turning in our homework late. But this is kind of like going to a kegger instead of finishing that party, because if we finish this pipeline, it's going to add an additional 100 to 120 parts per million. I mean, it's going to represent a gigantic increase in the amount of greenhouse gases we're pumping into the atmosphere. So I believe that it isn't exactly hyperbole to say that Keystone XL represents game over for the environment. I mean, this could be a complete, this could be the pipeline that broke the camel's back.
But I've read that whether the pipeline's put in or not, they're still gonna mine the tar sands, and that oil will go somewhere.
Right, and that's certainly an argument they make, and the argument they actually make. This is one of those like, oh well, if you don't want us to use a gun, we'll stab you to death kind of things. Is that if they don't have these pipelines, they're going to have to use gigantic oil tankers like the Exxon Valdez, for example, that sank over here. Or, well, you can't see it, it's sank over here. And the tankers are very, and it's funny because they'll say, these tankers are unsafe and we can't it's really bad for the environment for us to transport oil in them, and then they turn around and do it anyway. So it's the logic there is really baffling. But yeah, so they claim that they will transport this via tanker to refineries anyway, and that's certainly what they've done before and what they've done in the past. But as we dig further into our oil resources and transportation costs get higher and higher, the overall efficiency of doing that doesn't work. So what they're trying to do here is make a very efficient way for them to continue to mine these what will be increasingly high value resources. And if we stop this pipeline, they won't be able to do that. So it'll change the economics of the system essentially. If I've got a really thick milkshake and I can eat it with a spoon at a very, very slow rate, or I can drink it through a straw at a faster rate, obviously I'm going to consume less of the milkshake over a certain amount of time if I'm having to use the spoon because there is no straw. It's a really bad analogy. Still. So do we have any questions? I think we're right at 10 till. Yes, sir.
How does this extraction compare to similar tar sand extraction in the United States? Is that not being considered anymore? Or?
We do a very small amount of tar sand extraction in the United States. It happens in Utah. And I don't believe we're strip mining that. I believe that we're actually drilling horizontal wells for that. Okay. And that's so.
So what's in Wyoming is coal. Basically.
Yes, that's the Powder Basin coal reservoir, right. And they're certainly strip mining that. So that's where we stand. Yes, sir.
Have the geologists, you mentioned the earthquake fault lines. Have the geologists overall been studying the fact that the Earth's crust is gradually moving and can cause all kinds of problems to maybe that's why they've had so many problems with the pipelines, because the crust is moving.
Right, and I mean, we certainly understand continental drift, or we think we understand continental drift from a scientific standpoint. And what ends up happening though with continental drift is most of the United States sits on one plate essentially. So most of it moves in tandem. But you do have slip faults, like the New Madrid line over here, where you get it shifts and it causes really crazy tectonic problems. It actually kind of looks like a triangle in one point, pushes onto the other two. And so geologists have certainly looked into the seismic activity in the area. We know there was a magnitude 4.3 earthquake down in this area in the recent past, and while there is no, how are you supposed to say this because of the oil companies? While there is no peer-reviewed independent scientific research correlating increased seismic activities in areas where we're using hydrochemical fracturing in shale deposits, we've had a lot more earthquakes in places where you don't have earthquakes, like Arkansas and North Texas and Oklahoma, where they are hydrofracturing for natural gas deposits in shale. So we could see a lot more. We could see a lot more seismic activity along the length of the pipeline. Do we have any other questions?
Moving by pipeline is the most energy efficient way of moving it, correct?
That is correct. It is the most energy efficient, and it's certainly the most cost effective for the oil companies. Those things are usually tied pretty well together, and those tax incentives are involved. Let me make sure that we didn't have any other really fun facts here. So they don't necessarily have to strip mine. Oh, yes, sir.
Here you talk about the pipelines being the most cost effective. Are they basically gravity from high to low, or are they pressurized?
They have to be pressurized. The pipelines actually run more or less level. They follow the slope of the land, and in theory, this does slope sort of downward. But what it really, it's running along the continental shelf, so it stays pretty level. Or continental shelf. It was running along the continental plain off of the Rockies, so it stays pretty level.
But there is some sort of pressurization on the fluids running through them.
And so they essentially have pumping stations located along the entire length of the pipeline, and those pumping stations enable them to move the hydrocarbons through generally at pretty good velocity. But since it's so thick, and since the only way to loosen it up is through heat, they also heat it. So you have this very hot slurry of toxic hydrocarbons moving at pressure through these pipelines, essentially. Yes, sir?
Is there any talk about an automatic shut-off valve? Is that conceivable?
They do have automatic shut-off valves for these, and there are fail-safes that are triggered. That being said, they don't always trigger because they can't. This 2,000-mile pipeline, they can't actually keep track of small cracks or small impairments, and a catastrophic blowout can take them by surprise. But yes, they actually have a monitoring station in Calgary that monitors the entire length of the pipeline, and they have the ability to shut it off in various places. And they were able to shut off the Pegasus pipeline down here relatively quickly, and the leaks in 2010, right after Keystone 1 was completed, they were able to use the automatic shut-off in those cases as well. But not after, not before a whole bunch of crude or synthetic crude dumped out. Yes, sir?
Another question about having the pipeline buried.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult, I would think, of determining any small leaks, as you were talking about.
Exactly.
And they could go on for years.
Exactly. If you're moving, I keep doing this math, and it's kind of dumb for me to do it because I'm clearly not very fast at it. If you're moving 32 million gallons of synthetic crude through this pipeline, I don't think you're going to notice if 31.5 million gallons are getting to the end of the line. They can, in theory, they know how much they're losing along the way, and it's not a non-zero. It's a non-zero number. They're definitely losing some, but they don't know where that's going to be.
Do they have to report that to anyone?
Not really, unfortunately. And in some cases, they're allowed a certain amount of pipeline loss. So, well, if we don't have any further questions, I think it is 7:55. So I've got us done right at 5 minutes early.
Oh, you're all done?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm efficient with my time.
Okay. All right. Well, let's thank Stuart. He obviously did a lot of research and a lot of work. So thank you, Stuart.
You can email me, Stuart@environmentmissouri.org. I have business cards over there as well, and you should all talk to Rebecca. She is an awesome intern, and she was instrumental in helping me prepare for this. So thank you, Rebecca.
A website on site.
And yes, ma'am.
Stuart, what's your daily job? What do you do daily?
That depends. So yesterday I got up at 5 in the morning and drove to Columbia to meet with some donors. and I gave them some updates on our campaigns to protect the current river and make sure our state parks are fully funded. And then I drove to Kansas City, and while I was in Kansas City, since I had some free time, I did some of the research on this, specifically the parts relating to the First Nations tribes while sitting in a coffee shop. And then I had a donor meeting in the evening, and then I took notes on a conference call on the drive back to St. Louis, and got home at 10 and decided I wasn't going to work anymore. But then I spend a lot of time working with the media. I do a lot of press work, writing letters to the editor, writing opinion pieces. I spend a lot of time doing policy work, for example, figuring out exactly why. I mean, we all know that we should protect the current river, but producing a citizen's guide that we can use to activate and engage the public is a large part of what I do. So I kind of tell people my job is to have conversations with people. I'm essentially a grassroots activist and a community organizer and an advocate for the environment. I told my 4-year-old niece that I was the Lorax, and that worked.
No.
So.
Well, do you work for the conservation department, or who do you actually work for?
So I work for Environment Missouri, which is a nonprofit, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit, which allows us to do research work and do work with grants. And we also have a separate entity called Environment Missouri by itself, and that allows us to work with legislators on coming up with policy solutions that help protect our air and water and open spaces.
Have you had a chance to even look or think about Illinois' fracking regulations that are going to save Illinois from harm?
I haven't looked into it. I know that, so Environment Missouri is part of a federation of state-based groups, and we have a federal arm, and so there is an Environment Illinois run by a nice gentleman named Max. And I'm sure that Max has dug into it, and I would be interested in hearing what he thinks, but I have not looked into Illinois' fracking regulations.
Well, I'm sure Stuart would be happy to answer any questions you have. It's 8 o'clock. Feel free to stay and ask or go. But thank you all for coming.